is the best solution still today, and the Canal du Midi shows the way.
The Canal du Midi was only one of dozens of projects Louis XIV built in his lust for power and glory. But by the end of his reign, his profligate spending brought France to the brink of ruin. His autocratic rule and huge debts would sow the seeds of revolt a century later.
In 1789, the monarchy was deposed by the French Revolution. King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette had their heads cut off in the Place du Roi. But the reign of terror would turn in on itself, and Danton and Robespierre and the other fathers of the French Revolution would either be murdered in their bathtub or die by the guillotine themselves. And out of this chaos would come a young, brilliant general from Corsica who would lead France into a new era of empire.
1795, a young officer from a small Mediterranean island is about to make his first bid to seize power. Paris is reeling from 3 years of bloody turmoil in the wake of the French Revolution. His reign would capture the imagination of the French people and launch him onto the world stage as one of the greatest conquerors in history. His name is Napoleon Bonaparte.
Napoleon was a force of nature. Audacity was his middle name. Napoleon imposed himself upon Europe with such force that he goes down in the annals with Caesar and few others.
Napoleon's rise was lightning fast. From the head of the Army of the Interior to commander-in-chief of the forces in Italy in just 1 year.
In 1796, Austria attacked French troops in Italy, and Napoleon took a disaffected and undernourished army and turned it into a veritable force. He beat Austria in battle after battle, eating up most of northern Italy, finally even bringing that serene Republic of Venice to its knees. When Napoleon returned to Paris, he was a star, and then he started to take over. But believe me, after 10 years of the blood and guts of the French Revolution, the people of Paris and France were ready to say, praise the Lord. In 1804, Napoleon was crowned emperor at Notre Dame. This said, there's a preparatory drawing of Jacques-Louis David of the event where Napoleon's taking the crown from the Pope and crowning himself. He also turned to his brother and said, if Daddy could only see us now. Now, with his astounding ego, it's interesting that Napoleon was averse to creating monuments to himself, but he created one, 70,000 tons of stone in the shape of an arch, modeled on the Arch of Titus in the Forum of Rome. It would be called the Arc de Triomphe.
In 1809, Napoleon chose architect François Chalgrin's design for his triumphal arch. For a site, Napoleon decided on the end of the Avenue des Champs-Élysées, in the Place de l'Étoile. The structure would consist of a simple arch with a vaulted passageway, 98 feet high and 49 feet wide. In all, 164 feet high and 148 feet wide. The arch would be twice as big as its inspiration in Rome. At the base of the arch's pillars are 4 huge relief sculptures commemorating the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. The view of that grand arch, standing majestically like a crown atop the most celebrated street in Paris, had power and glory written all over it.
Napoleon was a self-made man, and that's in many ways what much of the revolution stood for, was that kind of brash individualism which took people's breath away.
By 1812, Napoleon had conquered most of Europe, but then the boy bit off more than he could chew. He invaded Russia. The rest, as we say, is history. Poor supply trains, harsh winters, the resiliency of the Russian people, Napoleon was defeated, forced to abdicate, and exiled to the island of Elba. But he escaped and enjoyed a short reprise to power we call the 100 Days, before he was defeated at Waterloo and exiled again, this time to St. Helena, and for good. Perhaps in respect and awe that the French felt for Napoleon, they continued the work on the Arc de Triomphe until it was finished in 1836. And the Arc de Triomphe would stand as the emblem of France until a wiry, bizarre skeleton of a building made out of iron would change the idea of an urban skyline forever.
The Arc de Triomphe would tower over Paris for another 50 years before succumbing to a spire that would seize the imagination of the world. In 1889, Paris would build itself one of the most memorable and daring monuments on Earth, the Eiffel Tower. Napoleon was not short. At 5 feet 6.5 inches, he was even slightly taller than the average Frenchman of the 19th century. In the years after Napoleon's defeat, France survived 3 bloody revolutions in its turbulent move away from kings and emperors toward democracy. The 1880s marked the zenith of the French Empire, a colonial superpower covering 1/3 of Africa, Indochina, and a wide swath of the Caribbean. The International Exhibition of Paris of 1889 was designed to celebrate the centennial of the Revolution and establish a new era of power and glory for France. The French government chose a grand centerpiece for the expo, an epic 1,000-foot tower, a bold symbol of optimism and self-confidence.
The Minister of Commerce, Edouard Lacroix, saw it as a symbol of progress, where he said humanity gravitates endlessly upward.
A design competition considered 100 proposals, including one from the engineering firm of Gustave Eiffel. Since the 1830s, engineers had been trying to build such a tower without success. Eiffel's international reputation as a superb builder of enormous bridges and megastructures, and his elegant design for the tower, made him the easy winner. But Eiffel's tower didn't please everyone. As soon as his design plans were made public, there was an enormous outcry from Parisian artists and intellectuals.
It was claimed that it was ugly, it was industrial, it was useless. It was a travesty to the Parisian landscape, which contained all sorts of wonderful classical structures.
Today we take the Eiffel Tower for granted, but if you think about it in its time, this thing was pretty bizarre. Gustave Eiffel was about to transform the concept and appearance not only of a civil structure, but an entire city skyline. This thing was going to be the forerunner of the skyscraper, and a lot of folks in Paris didn't dig it. Just like 100 years later, they didn't particularly like the pyramid from EMPIRES in front of the Louvre. But with the Eiffel Tower, it wasn't just the city do-gooders, but serious architects and writers voraciously lobbied against it. Guy de Maupassant supposedly said, "I'll eat there because it's the only place in Paris where I don't have to look at the thing."
The tower would be 985 feet tall, the tallest man-made structure in the world. In January 1887, Eiffel broke ground at the Champ de Mars on the left bank of the Seine and hit his first problem. Soil samples for the site of the 2 piers along the river were wet and soft, a serious obstacle for a 7,000-ton tower. Eiffel's solution? An innovative approach to anchoring his massive tower. For the riverside foundations, he sunk airtight iron chambers, or caissons, so workers could excavate below the water level right down to a solid rock footing. The foundations were set on the diagonal, so the tower's 4 massive columns would exert their thrust at right angles to the foundation blocks. Eiffel displayed his genius for innovation in his design for the cylindrical shoes that hold the columns. In each, he placed a hydraulic piston so he could align the columns precisely once they were erected. Eiffel now faced the single greatest challenge of all: wind. His solution would chart the course for all future skyscraper technology. The biggest names of 20th century architecture would all follow in his footsteps. Eiffel was a leading authority in the aerodynamics of high frames, but even he was building into the unknown. Eiffel utilized a series of lattice-trussed piers, precisely calculated with incurving edges to mitigate the effects of wind. He designed the tower so that it would never sway more than 4 to 5 inches in the strongest wind. On July 1st, 1887, the tower began to rise. Huge pieces of the iron structure were hoisted into place by steam-powered cranes. 2/3 of their rivets were inserted in the shops to allow quick assembly on the site.
Now, one of the ways in which Eiffel did things rapidly was to prefabricate parts. He was a master at organizing his projects.
Eiffel's streamlined construction paid off. In contrast to the decades it took to construct earlier large monuments, or nearly 2 centuries to build Notre Dame, Eiffel's tower was completed in only 22 months with just 300 iron workers. When it was completed in 1889, Gustave Eiffel's masterpiece replaced the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt as the tallest structure in the world, a record it retained until 1930, when it was surpassed by New York City's Chrysler Building.
What's wonderful about the Eiffel Tower is that it so horrified the French for the first few years after it was built. It reflected French technological modernity, architectural audacity that did not lay well with some of the traditional elites. And today, it's now regarded as simply beautiful.
On June the 21st, 1889, the Eiffel Tower was open to the world. Gustave Eiffel conducted personally guided tours for many celebrities and royals, including Buffalo Bill, the Shah of Persia, the King of Siam, the Prince of Wales, even Thomas Edison. Young women bought dresses called Eiffel climbers. The tower was the hit of the exposition, attracting almost 2 million people. Gustave Eiffel had financed almost 80% of the tower in exchange for the proceeds from all the concessions. He got his money back within a year, and the tower eventually made him a very rich man.
The Eiffel Tower symbolized an ideal Republican society. That is, the towers made up of many small pieces that interconnect and mutually support each other, all people from all walks of life mutually supporting each other in a democratic government, holding up the republic and moving it forward.
In spite of the cranky cab drivers of Paris, I love this town and I love France. And then again, cab drivers are cranky anywhere. If I could go back in time, a few things at the top of my wish list would be to hang out for a weekend at Versailles with Louis XIV, or sip a coffee with one of my own personal heroes, Victor Hugo, or watch Cézanne paint or Rodin sculpt. As it is, I'm quite content to take my coffee looking up at Notre Dame, or staring at the stained glass of Chartres Cathedral, or gazing up at the Eiffel Tower and wondering